His kiss wasn't a question. It was a statement, a declaration of ruin. The expensive whiskey on his breath was sharp, a bitter counterpoint to the clean, masculine scent of his cologne that clung to the plush leather seats of the car. His hand wasn't gentle on my neck. It was an anchor holding me in place as if he feared I might dissolve into the shadows from which I had appeared. I could feel the desperate, frantic energy pouring off him, a silent scream that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the world he had just escaped. His eyes were closed, his jaw tight, and in the warm yellow glow of the interior light, I saw not a man trying to possess a woman, but a man trying to hold himself together. I was just the vessel for his despair, a stranger in the dark who had stumbled into the epicenter of his personal earthquake. My own fear, the icy terror that had driven me into this gilded cage on wheels, had momentarily receded, replaced by the shocking, raw intimacy of this collision. He was broken. I was broken. And here, in the anonymous cocoon of a black SUV parked somewhere in the sleeping heart of Chicago, our shattered pieces were grinding against each other, creating a friction that felt dangerously like solace. My own cheap clothes, the threadbare coat now discarded on the floor mat, felt a universe away from the crisp, unbuttoned collar of his white shirt and the fine wool of his suit jacket. We were two people from different species, breathing the same recycled, desperate air. The sheer gut-wrenching panic that had led me to this moment was a physical weight in my chest, a cold stone of reality that even the heat of his touch couldn't melt. If you've ever known that feeling of being completely and utterly trapped, with your back pressed so hard against a wall that you can feel the bricks scraping your soul, show some love and hit that like button, because you know the impossible choices a person has to make just to survive until the next morning. To understand how a 24-year-old widow, haunted by ghosts of every kind, ended up in the back of a stranger's car, losing the last remnants of her innocence, you have to go back just a few hours. You have to understand the night it all fell apart, the night the Chicago wind felt less like weather and more like a predator, and the night I learned that desperation has a taste, metallic and bitter, like cheap iron and frozen tears. It all started with the sound of heavy fists on our apartment door. Not the polite rap of a neighbor, but the deep, bone-jarring thud of men who don't expect to be kept waiting. My late husband, Mark, had been gone for 6 months, the victim of a construction accident that was as senseless as it was sudden. He had been my whole world, charming, full of laughter, and cursed with a belief that he could always find a shortcut, always outsmart the system. He left me with a heart full of memories, and a shoebox full of debts to men who didn't care about death certificates. Men like the ones outside my door. For the first few months, they had been manageable. They took what little insurance money I had. They took my grandmother's ring. They took my dignity in small weekly installments. But tonight, their tone had changed. I'd heard them in the hallway, their voices low and gravelly. They weren't talking about money anymore. They were talking about making an example. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I knew I couldn't stay. I didn't even grab a bag. All I had was the thin coat on my back and the worn-out boots on my feet. The fire escape was my only chance. The metal was so cold it burned my hands, each rung a protest of groaning, rusted metal in the suffocating silence of the alley. I landed hard on the cracked pavement below, my ankles screaming in protest. Then I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The streets of Pilsen, usually so vibrant and alive, felt like a labyrinth designed by my deepest fears. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like my name being whispered. I could hear them behind me, not close, but there. A constant looming presence. They weren't sprinting. They were hunting, enjoying the chase. I ran for what felt like an eternity, my lungs on fire, a stitch in my side so sharp it felt like a knife. I cut through alleyways that smelled of grease and garbage, my boots splashing through unseen puddles of icy water. I finally stumbled out onto a cleaner, quieter street, the kind of place where the air itself seemed to hum with wealth. Towering glass buildings reflected the sterile glow of the streetlights. Behind a restaurant with a name I couldn't pronounce, where valets in smart red jackets stood waiting, was a dark service alley. It was an oasis of silence. Leaning against the cold brick wall, I gasped for air, my breath pluming in white clouds in front of my face. That's when I saw it. It was a gleaming black SUV, a monstrosity of chrome and tinted glass that looked more like an armored vehicle than a car. It was a fortress on wheels, parked discreetly in the darkest part of the alley. It was everything I wasn't: secure, powerful, untouchable. And then I saw it. A detail so small, so insignificant, it felt like a miracle. One of the back doors wasn't fully latched. It was ajar by less than an inch. A careless oversight in a world that seemed to pride itself on perfect security. My mind raced. The restaurant was obviously one of those Michelin star places. The owner was inside, probably sipping $1,000 wine, completely oblivious to the world outside his bubble of opulence. If I could just slip inside, just for a few hours, hide, breathe, be invisible until the hunters gave up and moved on. It was a crazy, reckless idea, born of pure animalistic terror, but it was the only idea I had. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. The door opened with a soft, expensive click that sounded deafening in the silence. I slid inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind me, plunging myself into a world of absolute darkness and the scent of money. The smell was overwhelming. Rich leather, a hint of wood polish, and something else, a clean, sharp scent that was distinctly masculine. It was both intimidating and, in a strange way, calming. I didn't dare sit on the seats. Instead, I curled myself into a tight ball on the floor of the back seat, pulling my knees to my chest and tucking my head down, trying to make myself as small and unnoticeable as humanly possible. The silence inside the car was a living thing. It pressed in on me, amplifying the frantic thumping of my own heart. For the first time in an hour, I felt a flicker of safety. I was hidden. I was a ghost. All I had to do was wait. I must have drifted into a state of exhausted shock, because the next thing I knew, the driver's side door was wrenched open, and the entire vehicle shuddered as a heavy body slumped into the driver's seat. The door slammed shut with a solid, definitive thud that echoed the shattered composure of the man who had just entered. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. My breath caught in my throat, a painful, silent scream. He didn't turn on the interior lights. He just sat there, his presence filling the enclosed space with a palpable aura of cold fury and profound sadness. I could hear his ragged breathing, the sharp intake of air as he leaned his head back against the headrest. He smelled of the cold night air and that expensive whiskey. I remained perfectly still on the floor, convinced that a single twitch, a single breath, would betray my existence. The engine purred to life, a low, powerful growl that vibrated through the floor and up into my bones. The SUV pulled smoothly out of the alley and into the stream of city traffic. I risked a peek over the edge of the seat. We were heading north on Lake Shore Drive, the glittering skyline of Chicago, a panorama of indifferent beauty on our left, the vast black emptiness of Lake Michigan on our right. The city lights streaked by, hypnotic and surreal. He drove aimlessly, a man running from something I couldn't see. He wasn't going anywhere, he was just going. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy with unspoken things. He was lost in his own world of pain, and I was a stowaway in his misery. It was the reflection that gave me away. After maybe 20 minutes of this aimless, silent driving, his gaze flickered up to the rearview mirror. His head tilted slightly. He had seen me. I saw his eyes widen in the mirror, a flash of silver in the dark. I braced myself for the explosion. The shouting, the accusations, the screech of tires as he threw me out onto the side of the road. My body tensed, ready for the inevitable violence of discovery, but it never came. He just kept looking at my reflection in the mirror. His anger, so palpable just moments before, seemed to drain away, replaced by a startled, strange kind of clarity. He didn't look angry. He looked hollowed out. In the flickering dance of passing headlights, our eyes met in the small rectangle of the mirror. It felt like he was looking right through my fear, past the grime on my face and the terror in my eyes, and seeing the exhaustion deep within my soul. And in his gaze I saw not a threat, but a reflection of my own desolation. He was a man drowning, and he had just realized someone else was in the water with him. Without a word, he pulled the car off the main road and down a deserted access path that led towards the lakefront, stopping under the deep shadow of an old oak tree. He cut the engine, and the world was plunged back into a profound silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city and the sound of our breathing. For a long moment, we just sat there, a CEO in a bespoke suit and a terrified widow in rags, two strangers connected by nothing but the shared darkness. Then slowly he turned in his seat. He reached over and flipped a switch, and the interior of the car was bathed in that soft, warm, amber light. It was the first time I truly saw his face. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with sharp, aristocratic features, dark hair that was slightly disheveled, and the most intense grey eyes I had ever seen. They were eyes that had seen and conquered worlds, but tonight they were shattered. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a low, rough whisper devoid of menace. It was a genuine question, and I, looking at the raw, unguarded pain in his face, couldn't find a single word to answer him. It was then that he reached over, not to hurt me, but to brush a stray piece of hair from my cheek, and as his fingers made contact with my skin, an electric current passed between us, a spark of shared humanity in the suffocating loneliness. He leaned closer, and the vast, sterile space of the luxury car suddenly became the smallest, most intimate room in the world. He was about to erase the line between his world and mine. The kiss broke as abruptly as it began. He pulled back, a ragged breath escaping his lips, and the spell shattered. The intimate bubble of shared despair popped, and we were once again what we had always been, a powerful man in a $5,000 suit and a terrified woman in clothes that barely kept out the cold. He didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead through the windshield, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The silence that fell between us was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of what had just happened, a desperate, nameless act that defied all logic and social strata. He had used me to staunch a wound, and I had let him, because for a few fleeting moments, his pain had made me forget my own. I slowly, carefully pushed myself up from the floor and onto the plush leather of the back seat, my movements cautious, as if he were a wild animal I might startle. I straightened my thin coat, a useless gesture of reclaiming a dignity I wasn't sure I still possessed. He still hadn't spoken, hadn't even acknowledged my movement. The amber glow of the interior light seemed to cast him in stone, a perfect sculpture of wealth and misery. Finally he spoke, his voice low and devoid of the raw emotion from moments before. It was clipped, efficient, the voice of a man accustomed to command. "I'll take you wherever you need to go," he said, not turning to face me. "Just give me a street corner." There was no, "Are you okay?" No. "What's your name?" It was a transaction. The brief, shocking connection was being severed, cauterized by the cold reality of our separate worlds. I gave him the name of a street a few blocks from a friend's place, a place I hoped I could stay for a night or two before the loan sharks figured out where to look next. He nodded once, his jaw tight, and started the car. The drive was short, maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity of charged, suffocating silence. He was erasing me from his night, from his memory. I was an anomaly, a glitch in his perfectly controlled existence that needed to be deleted. He pulled up to the designated corner, the street dimly lit and deserted. He put the car in park but kept the engine running, a clear sign that this was the end of the line. Before I could even reach for the door handle, he turned, and for the first time since the kiss, he looked at me. His grey eyes were guarded again, the storm within them banked and hidden behind a wall of impenetrable ice. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. Without a word, he pressed it into my hand. It was a heavy, crisp stack of $100 bills. I stared at the money, then at his face. It wasn't an offer. It was a dismissal. It was a payment for my silence, for my time, for the piece of myself I had lost in the back of his car. It was meant to close the books on our encounter, to ensure I would never, ever try to find him. "Take it," he said, his voice flat. "Disappear." Tears pricked my eyes, hot and shameful. I wanted to throw the money back in his face, to scream that I wasn't for sale, that my desperation didn't make me a commodity. But I couldn't. That money wasn't an insult. It was a lifeline. It was a way out. It was a new start, bought and paid for with my last shred of innocence. I closed my fingers around the bills, the paper feeling alien and electric against my skin. I gave him a single, shaky nod. I opened the door and stepped out into the biting Chicago wind, which now felt less like a threat and more like a harsh baptism. I didn't look back as I walked away, but I could feel the weight of his gaze on me until I turned the corner, vanishing back into the shadows from which I came. For him, it was a night he would try to forget, a regrettable lapse in his ironclad control. For me, it was the night a new, terrifying and uncertain life began. The money was exactly what he intended it to be, a key. It bought me a bus ticket to a small town 2 hours outside the city, a place where no one knew my name, and the ghosts of Mark's debts couldn't find me. It paid for the first month's rent on a tiny, run-down apartment above a bakery, the constant smell of warm bread a small, comforting grace in my new, solitary existence. It bought me groceries and a new lock for my door. I found a job waiting tables at a local diner, the work grueling and the pay minimal, but it was honest. It was mine. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I tried not to think about that night, about the man with shattered grey eyes. I tried to convince myself it was a fever dream, a strange and terrible hallucination born of fear. But some nights, I would wake up with the ghost of his whiskey-laced kiss on my lips and the phantom weight of his hand on my neck. 2 months after I disappeared, my body betrayed the secret my mind was trying so desperately to bury. It started with a wave of nausea in the morning that I blamed on the diner's greasy food. Then came the exhaustion, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that settled over me like a shroud. And then, the terrifying, undeniable truth. My period was late. I spent my last few dollars on a pregnancy test from the local pharmacy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely open the box. I sat on the edge of my bathtub in that cramped, water-stained bathroom and waited for the 2 longest minutes of my life. When the second pink line appeared, faint but unmistakable, a sound escaped my throat that was half sob, half scream. My world, so precariously pieced back together, shattered all over again. I was pregnant with the child of a faceless, nameless man who had paid me to disappear. A man who, for all I knew, might be married, might have a family, might have believed he was sterile. The thought was a cold spike of fear in my gut. What if he was one of those powerful men who would do anything to make a problem like me and a child go away permanently? The terror was so absolute it nearly paralyzed me. I had 2 choices. I could end it, pretend it never happened, and continue on with my quiet, lonely life. Or I could keep it. I could bring a child into this world with nothing to offer but a mother who was broken and alone, a child who would be a constant reminder of the worst night of my life. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window of my small apartment, looking out at the quiet, sleeping town, and I placed a trembling hand on my still, flat stomach, and in the silent darkness, I felt it. A flicker. Not a kick, not a movement, but a feeling. A primal, fierce, protective instinct that rose up from the deepest part of my soul. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a problem. This was a life. My child. A piece of me that no one could take away. In that moment, a decision was made. I would have this baby. I would raise this child on my own, and I would love them with a ferocity that would make up for everything we lacked. I would never try to find him. I would protect my child from his world of power and ice, a world that would only see them as a complication or a bargaining chip. He had given me the money to disappear, and for the sake of my child, I would. 4 years is a lifetime, or it's just long enough to build a new one from scratch. My life revolved around Leo. He was my sun, my moon, my entire universe. He was born with a full head of unruly black hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. His gaze was startlingly intense for a child, and when he looked at me, I felt a love so profound it physically ached. Our life wasn't easy. I worked 2 jobs now, the diner in the mornings and cleaning offices at night. Our apartment was small, our furniture was second-hand, and our dinners were often simple. But our home was filled with laughter, with superhero stories, with Lego castles that took over the entire living room floor. Leo was a happy, bright, energetic boy. He was everything. He was my redemption. And every time I looked into his serious grey eyes, so impossibly familiar, I saw the ghost of his father. It was a secret I carried deep within me, a silent, heavy stone in the foundation of the life I had built for us. Julian Sterling, meanwhile, had spent the last 4 years building his empire. Sterling Enterprises had become a global behemoth. His face was on the cover of Forbes and Fortune. He had conquered Wall Street, his name a synonym for ruthless efficiency and brilliant strategy. He had broken off his engagement to Victoria Vance shortly after that fateful night, the final crack in their relationship having become an unbridgeable chasm. He lived in a sterile, echoing mansion in Lincoln Park, a testament to his success and his solitude. The diagnosis of infertility, confirmed and reconfirmed by the best doctors money could buy, was a fact carved into his soul. It was a truth that made every billion-dollar acquisition, every corporate victory feel hollow. A legacy of steel and glass was a cold comfort for a man who believed his bloodline ended with him. To combat the emptiness, he threw himself into philanthropy. He built hospitals, funded scholarships, and poured millions into underprivileged communities. It was a way to build a legacy without an heir, a way to be a father to the city itself. It was this work, this carefully constructed public persona of the benevolent billionaire, that brought him to a small underfunded community center in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, the very neighborhood I had fled 4 years earlier. It was a place I had recently started bringing Leo for a free toddler arts program, a welcome reprieve from our tiny apartment. The day was bright and cold. Julian was there for a photo opportunity, a sterile meet and greet to launch a new educational initiative. He smiled for the cameras, shook hands with the local politicians, and delivered a speech written by his PR team about opportunity and empowerment. He felt nothing. It was all part of the game, the performance of a life that looked perfect from the outside. As his team orchestrated the event, his gaze drifted past the crowd of reporters and donors to an adjacent playground, a patch of green grass and colorful plastic equipment where children were laughing and playing, blissfully unaware of the charade taking place just a few yards away. And then he saw him. A small boy no older than 4, with a mop of unruly black hair chasing a red soccer ball with a determined, clumsy gait. The boy was fast, a blur of energy and concentration. He stumbled, his small legs tangling beneath him, and went down hard on the gravel path. A sharp, startled cry cut through the air. An instinct Julian Sterling didn't know he possessed, a dormant, primal urge, took over his body. He excused himself mid-sentence from a conversation with a city alderman, his voice a clipped apology. He strode across the grass, bypassing his bewildered security detail, his eyes locked on the small, crying figure. He knelt beside the child, his expensive trousers immediately covered in dust. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than he'd heard it in years, stripped of its usual corporate authority. "Hey, little man," he said gently, his hand hovering over the boy's scraped knee. "That was quite a fall. You're tough, though, right?" The boy looked up at him, his face streaked with tears and dirt, and as their eyes met, Julian felt the world tilt on its axis. He was looking at a pair of startlingly intense slate-grey eyes. He was looking at the stubborn set of a jaw he saw in his own reflection every morning. It was like looking at a photograph of himself from a forgotten childhood album, a perfect miniature echo of his own face. The air left his lungs. The doctor's words, "Zero chance, a medical impossibility," screamed in his mind, a frantic, desperate denial against the impossible truth staring him in the face. It was in that moment of silent, earth-shattering shock that a frantic voice, a voice he hadn't heard in 4 years but had never truly forgotten, called out from across the playground. "Leo! Oh my God, Leo! Are you okay?" I saw him before he saw me. One moment, I was chatting with another mom near the swings, my eyes half on Leo as he tore across the grass with the boundless energy only a 4-year-old possesses. The next, my blood ran cold. A crowd had gathered near the community center entrance, men in dark suits, women with clipboards, the glint of camera lenses. It was a media event of some kind, the sort of thing that never happened in our neighborhood. And then, through a gap in the crowd, I saw him, Julian Sterling. Older, his features sharper, etched with a severity that 4 more years of conquering the world had carved into his face, but it was undeniably him. The sight of him was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I froze, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. This was my worst nightmare made real. The 2 worlds I had fought so desperately to keep separate were about to collide. Before I could process, before I could grab Leo and run, it happened. Leo fell. I saw his little body tumble, heard his sharp cry of pain, and a mother's instinct overrode everything else. But as I started to run towards him, I saw the impossible. Julian Sterling, the billionaire titan of industry, broke away from his entourage and strode directly to my son. He knelt in the dirt, his movements fluid and sure, and spoke to Leo with a gentleness that seemed utterly alien to the man I remembered. He was comforting my child. My mind short-circuited. Then, Leo looked up at him. I was too far away to see the expression on Julian's face, but I saw his body go rigid. I saw the subtle, sharp intake of breath, the way his hand froze in mid-air. He saw it. He knew. "Leo!" "Oh my God, Leo, are you okay?" The words were torn from my throat as I finally reached them, my own panic a rising tide. I knelt on the other side of Leo, my hands fluttering over his scraped knee, my eyes scanning him for any other injuries. But my focus was a pinpoint, a laser beam connecting me to the man still kneeling in front of my son. He slowly lifted his gaze from Leo's face to mine, and in his eyes I saw it all: shock, disbelief, confusion, and a dawning, terrifying comprehension. The haunted, beautiful eyes he had seen in the dark of his car 4 years ago were now staring back at him, wide with fear, in the bright, unforgiving light of day. He looked from me to Leo, then back to me again, the pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place with an audible, seismic crash. The foundation of his entire life, the bedrock of a truth he had accepted as absolute, was crumbling into dust right before his eyes. The world around us seemed to melt away. The reporters, the politicians, his security detail. It was all just noise. There was only the three of us, trapped in a bubble of silent, catastrophic revelation. "You," he breathed, the single word a universe of accusation and awe. "My name is Amelia, and if you've ever had a secret so big you thought it would tear you apart, and then watched it explode in the one way you never thought it would, let me know in the comments below. It's a feeling of falling without a net." His security team descended on us then, their faces a mixture of concern and confusion, trying to gently steer him back towards the event. He waved them away with an impatient, dismissive gesture, his eyes never leaving mine. The PR handlers were in a state of controlled panic, whispering into their headsets. This was not on the schedule. He stood up, his movements stiff, robotic. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and hard. Not a request, but a command. "Now." He gestured towards the community center building. There was no room for argument. I picked up a still sniffling Leo, holding him tight against my chest as if he were a shield, and followed him inside, the stares of the entire crowd burning into my back. He commandeered a small, cluttered office, dismissing the center's flustered director with a look. He closed the door, shutting out the world, and the silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Leo's soft hiccups against my shoulder. I put Leo down and gave him my phone to play a game, a desperate attempt to distract him from the suffocating tension in the room. He sat on a small, worn-out armchair in the corner, immediately absorbed in the bright colors on the screen, a small island of innocence in an ocean of adult cataclysm. Julian stood by the window, his back to me, staring out at the playground where his life had just been irrevocably altered. He was a tightly coiled spring of energy, a predator pacing a cage. "Is he—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The words, the very concept, were too monumental to be spoken aloud. My own voice, when I found it, was a trembling whisper. "His name is Leo." "Don't play games with me," he snapped, whirling around to face me. His grey eyes were blazing with a firestorm of emotions. "I am sterile. That is a medical fact. It is an impossibility. Doctors can be wrong," I said, my chin lifting with a defiance I didn't feel. He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed in the small room. "Wrong? I've seen the top specialists in the world. They were not wrong. This is a trick, a scheme. How did you find me? How long have you been planning this?" He advanced on me, his presence overwhelming. "You think you can show up with a child that happens to look like me and expect a payday? You have no idea who you're dealing with." The accusation was a slap in the face. The raw injustice of it burned away my fear, replacing it with a cold, hard anger. 4 years. 4 years of struggling, of working myself to the bone, of loving my son with every fiber of my being, of protecting him by staying completely and utterly invisible. And this was my reward, to be called a gold digger, a liar, a schemer. "A scheme," I said, my voice rising, shaking with repressed fury. "I have spent the last 4 years making sure you would never find us. I ran from you that night, and I have been running ever since. I worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads and food on our table. I have never asked for a single thing from you or anyone else. This is not a scheme, Mr. Sterling. This is my life. This is my son." The raw, undeniable truth in my voice seemed to pierce through his armor of cynicism. He stopped, his gaze faltering for a fraction of a second. The hurt in my eyes must have been so profound that it silenced him. He saw not a con artist, but a desperate mother pushed to her limit. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of profound frustration. "Then explain it," he demanded, his voice quieter now. laced with a desperate need to understand. Explain the impossible. So I told him. I told him everything. About the bus ticket, the small town, the morning sickness, the positive pregnancy test. I told him about my terror, my decision to raise the baby alone, my vow to protect him from this very moment. My voice trembled, but my resolve was firm. I wasn't asking him for anything. I was just giving him the truth he had demanded. He listened, his face an unreadable mask, his eyes searching mine for any hint of deception. The doctor's words from a decade ago were a fortress in his mind, and my story was a battering ram, trying to smash through walls he had long considered impenetrable. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. The only sound was the cheerful, tinny music from the game on my phone. "I don't believe you," he finally said, but the conviction in his voice was gone. It was replaced by a sliver of doubt, a hairline fracture in the foundation of his reality, and in that fracture I saw a flicker of something else, something he probably wasn't even aware of. Impossible hope. "There's only one way to know for sure," he said, his voice regaining its business-like tone. "A DNA test tomorrow." The next 24 hours were a blur. Julian's efficiency was terrifying. A discreet, white-gloved medical service came to my apartment the next morning. It was surreal watching these sterile professional people in my tiny, cluttered living room. They were quick, gentle with Leo, and gone in less than 15 minutes, leaving behind an unnerving silence. Julian didn't trust a public lab. The samples were flown by private jet to a specialized facility in Switzerland. He was a man who left nothing to chance. While he waited for the results that would either confirm his lie or shatter his world, Julian didn't start with me. He started with his past. Consumed by that storm of doubt and hope, he launched a discreet but thorough investigation. He went back to the original fertility clinic, a place he hadn't set foot in for nearly a decade. He was no longer the desperate young man receiving a devastating diagnosis. He was Julian Sterling, a man whose name opened any door. He demanded his original files, the raw data, not just the summaries. He hired his own team of independent medical experts to review them. Inconsistencies began to surface. Small things at first. A lab technician's signature that seemed off. A timestamp on a critical test that didn't align with his appointment records. It was enough to fuel his suspicion. His investigation soon led him down a dark, forgotten path, back to the one person who knew about his diagnosis before anyone else, the one person who had been by his side, her face a mask of loving sympathy when the doctor delivered the news. His ex-fiancée, Victoria Vance. Victoria had moved on and up. After their breakup, she had leveraged her connection to him into a successful career, culminating in a prestigious board seat at a major media conglomerate. She was a darling of the Chicago social scene, her image polished to a high sheen. Julian found her where she was most comfortable, at a glittering charity gala at the Art Institute of Chicago. The ballroom was a sea of jewels and champagne, the air thick with perfume and power. It was a stark, almost obscene contrast to the darkness of the questions he was about to ask. He cornered her on a secluded balcony overlooking the city lights. She greeted him with a practiced, dazzling smile, her eyes flicking over his shoulder, likely looking for a photographer. "Julian, darling, what a surprise. I didn't think this was your scene anymore." "We need to talk, Victoria," he said, his voice cutting through her pretense like a shard of ice. Her smile faltered. "About what?" "Honestly, Julian, isn't it a little late for a post-mortem on our relationship?" "This isn't about us," he said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her. "This is about the Ashton Clinic. 10 years ago." Her composure for the first time cracked. It was a micro-expression, a flicker of panic in her eyes so fast anyone else would have missed it, but Julian had been trained to spot weakness. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her hand tightening around the stem of her champagne flute. "Don't you?" he pressed, his voice relentless. "I'm talking about Dr. Alastair Finch, the one who ran my tests, the one who told me I was sterile. Funny thing, I did some digging. It turns out Dr. Finch lost his medical license 3 years ago for falsifying patient records. A real disgrace." Victoria's face had gone pale beneath her expensive makeup. She took a step back, but the balcony railing stopped her. She was trapped. "That has nothing to do with me," she whispered, her voice thin. "Doesn't it?" Julian's voice was dangerously soft now. "He was your family's doctor, wasn't he? He delivered you. Your father put him through medical school. A man who owed your family everything. He laid the trap, piece by excruciating piece." Under the weight of his relentless pressure, her polished facade didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The ugly, twisted truth finally spilled out, a torrent of confession whispered into the cold night air. Years ago, she had been terrified of losing him. She knew he wanted a family, an heir to his burgeoning empire. She also knew from her own medical issues that she could never give him one. Desperate to secure her place at his side, to build a prison of loneliness around him that would ensure he would never look elsewhere for the family she knew she couldn't provide, she had conspired with the disgraced doctor. It was easy. A few altered numbers on a lab report, a carefully worded, sympathetic diagnosis from a trusted family friend. She had built his cage of solitude, brick by brick, lie by lie, and then pretended to be his comfort within it. The call from the Swiss lab came the next afternoon as Julian stood in his silent, sterile office overlooking the city. He put the call on speaker, his hand trembling slightly as he listened to the clinical, detached voice of the geneticist. The words were clear, precise, and irrefutable. The probability of paternity is 99.9999%. Julian Sterling, you are the biological father of the child, Leo Hayes. The phone slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the mahogany desk. He sank into his chair, the sound of his own breathing roaring in his ears. He was a father. The lie he had lived with for a decade, the lie that had shaped every decision, every relationship, every hollow victory, was gone. And in its place was a truth so overwhelming it threatened to tear him apart. He was a father, and he had a son named Leo. The confirmation didn't bring elation. It brought a seismic, tectonic shift deep within his soul, a violent realignment of his entire universe. The first emotion to surface wasn't joy, but a rage so cold and pure it felt like a shard of ice in his chest. The DNA test was a piece of paper, but it was also a key unlocking a decade of a life lived in a cage he never knew was built for him. Victoria hadn't just lied to him. She had stolen his future. She had amputated a part of his identity and convinced him the phantom limb was a birth defect. He thought of the years of quiet despair, the hollow echo in his sprawling mansion, the countless nights he'd stared at the ceiling, wondering what the point of his empire was if there was no one to leave it to. She had orchestrated his loneliness with the precision of a master strategist. His revenge was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated corporate execution. He didn't want to just ruin her. He wanted to dismantle the very foundation of the life she had built on the ashes of his. He wanted her to understand the profound, systemic nature of what she had done. He waited 2 weeks, gathering his forces, moving his pieces into place on a chessboard she didn't even know she was playing on. He used his immense power not for financial gain, but for a justice that was almost biblical in its scope. The stage was the quarterly board meeting of the Vanguard Media Group, where Victoria Vance held her coveted board seat. It was a sterile, glass-walled room on the 50th floor of a skyscraper, overlooking the very city she had tried to conquer. She sat at the long, polished table, looking confident and immaculate, completely unaware that she was sitting at her own tribunal. When the agenda turned to new business, Julian Sterling walked into the room. His presence was an immediate shockwave, silencing the low chatter. He wasn't a shareholder, nor did he have any official business with Vanguard. He simply owned the silence in any room he entered. "Mr. Sterling," the chairman said, his voice a mixture of deference and confusion. "This is a closed meeting." "I'm aware," Julian said, his voice calm and level, a terrifying counterpoint to the storm in his eyes. He placed a slim file on the table. "I'm here to present evidence of gross misconduct and moral turpitude concerning one of your board members, Ms. Victoria Vance. Evidence that will not only necessitate her immediate removal, but will likely trigger a federal investigation into medical fraud." Victoria's face turned the color of ash. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, but no sound came out. Julian didn't look at her. He addressed the room, his voice a clinical, dispassionate weapon. He laid out the entire story, supported by irrefutable evidence. Sworn affidavits from the disgraced doctor, copies of the original and the falsified lab reports, financial records showing large, untraceable payments from a Vance family trust to the doctor's offshore account. He painted a portrait not of a jilted ex-lover, but of a calculated, malicious fraud that went to the very core of character and ethics. The members of the board, men and women who valued their reputations above all else, stared at Victoria with a dawning horror. She was no longer a colleague. She was a liability, a toxic asset that needed to be liquidated. Her career, her reputation, her carefully constructed world was obliterated in the space of 15 minutes. She was escorted from the room by security, a ghost in couture, her face a mask of silent, utter ruin. Julian walked out of that building and felt nothing. The victory was as hollow as his billions had been just a month ago. Destroying Victoria hadn't filled the gaping hole in his life. It had merely illuminated its edges. The real challenge wasn't dismantling an enemy's past. It was building a future with a son he didn't know and a woman he had grievously wronged. That evening, he drove himself to my apartment. He didn't arrive in his gleaming black SUV with a driver, but in a nondescript sedan, he drove himself. He was trading his armor for skin. He stood outside the door of my small second-floor walk-up, the smell of the bakery below hanging sweet and warm in the air. For a long moment, he just stood there, the sounds of my life, Leo's laughter, the tinny sound of a cartoon on the television, filtering through the thin wood of the door. This was it. This was the world he had created by accident, and then abandoned. When I opened the door, we stood in silence. He wasn't the furious, accusing titan from the community center. He was a man stripped bare, the raw vulnerability in his grey eyes mirroring the devastation I had seen on that night 4 years ago. He looked past me, into the tiny, cluttered yet warm space I called home. He saw the Lego castles on the floor, the finger paintings taped to the walls, the small pair of dinosaur-themed rain boots by the door. He saw a life that should have been his, too. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate, a pebble thrown into a canyon. "For what I said, for what I thought, for everything." I stepped aside and let him in. Leo, who had been hiding behind my legs, peeked out at the tall stranger. He looked at Julian with a child's frank curiosity, his head tilted, his grey eyes, so like the man in front of him, taking him in. "Hello, Leo," Julian said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. He slowly crouched down to Leo's level, a gesture that seemed to cost him a monumental effort. "My name is Julian." This was the beginning of the negotiation, not for money but for a life. That night after Leo was asleep, Julian laid out his plan. He spoke in the language he understood best: logistics, solutions, acquisitions. He would buy us a house in Lincoln Park, near his. He would set up a trust fund for Leo that would guarantee his future, his education, his every need. He would hire the best nannies, enroll Leo in the most exclusive preschools. He was offering me a golden cage, a life of luxurious ease, a world where I would never have to worry about money again. He was offering me everything he thought a woman like me could possibly want, and I refused. "I don't want your money, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't want a mansion or a nanny or a trust fund. I have been raising our son for 4 years without any of that. What he needs now isn't a benefactor. He needs a father." He looked at me, genuinely bewildered. He had just offered me the world, and I had turned it down. It was a response so outside his frame of reference that he didn't know how to process it. "I don't want to be absorbed into your life," I explained, my hands clasped in my lap to keep them from trembling. "This is our life, Leo's life. It's small and it's not glamorous, but it's real. If you want to be a part of it, you have to come here, to us. You have to learn our world, not just pay to move us into yours." I laid out my terms, not as a demand, but as a map to a foreign country he had to navigate. No nannies. He had to learn to do it himself. Weekends were for Leo. He had to show up, not just send gifts. We would do it on my terms, starting from the ground up, building something real, not just signing a contract. It was perhaps the most difficult negotiation of Julian Sterling's life. He was being asked to give up control, to be a novice, to learn a language of scraped knees and bedtime stories that was utterly alien to him. But as he looked around my small, love-filled apartment, at the evidence of a life built on something other than stock prices and market shares, he saw the one thing his billions could never buy: a home. And for the first time, he agreed to terms that offered him no profit, no leverage, only the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of a family. The beginning was not a fairy tale. It was messy, awkward, and beautiful. Julian's first attempts at fatherhood were a study in contrasts. This man, who could command a boardroom of sharks into submission, was utterly baffled by a 4-year-old's refusal to eat his broccoli. He arrived for his first dad weekend in a crisp suit, carrying a ridiculously expensive educational toy that Leo ignored in favor of a cardboard box. He tried to schedule their playtime in 30-minute increments. Like a business meeting, I watched from the sidelines, a gentle guide, letting him fail, letting him learn. I taught him that Leo's favorite superhero wasn't the most popular one, but a deep-cut character from an old comic book. I showed him the precise, non-negotiable way that the crusts had to be cut from a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I watched him sit on the floor of my living room, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened, looking completely out of place and yet more present than I had ever seen him, as he and Leo built an elaborate Lego castle. He started to change. The changes were small at first. He started leaving his phone in his coat pocket when he was with Leo. He started showing up in jeans and a sweater instead of a suit. He learned the names of all the characters in Leo's favorite cartoon. One Saturday, he showed up with a small scrape on his hand. When I asked about it, he looked almost embarrassed. "I was learning to ride a scooter," he admitted. "Leo said I had to learn if we were going to be a superhero team." He was learning to play. He was learning to be present. He was seeing the world not from the top of a skyscraper, but from the level of a 4-year-old's eyes. And in doing so, he began to heal the parts of himself he thought were long dead. The cold, sterile emptiness inside him began to be filled with the bright, unfiltered chaos of a child's love. My own caution began to melt away, replaced by a fragile, tentative trust. I saw him not as the broken man in the car or the angry billionaire in the office, but as Leo's father. I saw the genuine, unadulterated joy on his face when Leo ran into his arms at the end of the day. I saw the patience he was learning, the way he would sit for an hour and listen to a convoluted story that made no sense. He wasn't buying our affection. He was earning it. One Lego block, one bedtime story, one scooter lesson at a time. One rainy Sunday afternoon, we were all on the living room floor, a massive puzzle spread out between us. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of the rain against the window and the soft click of puzzle pieces fitting together. Leo was curled up asleep between us, his head resting on Julian's leg. It was a scene of such simple, profound domesticity, it made my heart ache. Julian looked at me over Leo's sleeping head, his grey eyes soft and unguarded. "I never knew," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I never knew it could feel like this." "Like what?" I whispered back. "Like enough," he said, his hand gently stroking Leo's hair. "Just this. It's enough." We were two people from different universes, two survivors of our own private shipwrecks who had found ourselves washed ashore on the same small island, an island named Leo. Our past was a complicated, painful story of a dark car on a rainy night. But our future was an unwritten page, and for the first time it was a story we might get to write together, a family forged not in a boardroom or at a society wedding, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of a sleeping child's breath. It was a messy, improbable, and beautiful beginning. The fragile peace of those Sunday afternoons was a soap bubble, beautiful and shimmering, but destined to pop. The world Julian inhabited, a world of calculated moves and public scrutiny, could not be kept at bay by the flimsy wooden door of my apartment forever. The press, scenting a seismic shift in the life of one of the city's most powerful and private men, began to circle. It started with whispers on gossip blogs. Julian Sterling, the perennial bachelor, was spending his weekends in a working-class neighborhood. Then came the grainy, long-lens photos of him pushing a laughing Leo on the swings at the local park. The captions were speculative, scandalous. Who was the mystery woman, and more importantly, who was the boy who bore such an uncanny resemblance to the billionaire? The bubble burst on a Tuesday. I was walking Leo home from his preschool when we were ambushed. A swarm of reporters and photographers seemed to materialize out of thin air, surrounding us on the sidewalk. Microphones were thrust in my face, questions shouted like accusations. "Amelia, is it true you're his secret mistress? Is that Julian Sterling's love child? How much is he paying you to keep quiet?" The flashbulbs were like a series of small explosions, blinding and terrifying. Leo, overwhelmed by the noise and the crush of bodies, buried his face in my side and began to cry. A primal, protective fury surged through me. I wrapped my arms around my son, trying to shield him, shouting at them to back away, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. Suddenly, a black car screeched to a halt beside us. The back door flew open, and two of Julian's security men, faces grim and professional, carved a path through the media scrum. One of them scooped a terrified Leo into his arms, while the other hustled me into the car. The door slammed shut, plunging us into a soundproofed silence as the car sped away, leaving the chaos behind. I pulled Leo onto my lap, murmuring reassurances, my own body trembling with adrenaline and rage. This was exactly what I had feared. This was the world I had tried to protect my son from, a world that would see him not as a little boy, but as a headline, a commodity, a scandal. Julian was waiting for us at his mansion. The moment I walked through the door, he saw the look on my face. "I'm so sorry, Amelia," he began, his own face a mask of cold fury directed not at me, but at the world he commanded. "I had a team monitoring the press. I never thought they'd find you so quickly. I never thought they'd be so vicious," I finished for him, my voice shaking. "You thought you could just dip your toe into our life and not cause ripples. Julian, this is a tsunami." They called Leo a love child. They asked me how much I was being paid. The dam of my carefully controlled emotions broke, and tears of anger and fear streamed down my face. "I can't do this. Leo can't do this. This isn't a life. It's a circus." He led me into a vast, silent living room that looked more like an art gallery than a place where people lived. He sat me down on a white sofa that probably cost more than my car and knelt in front of me, taking my hands in his. His touch was no longer awkward or hesitant. It was firm, grounding. "You're right," he said, his voice low and intense. "This is unacceptable, and it's my fault. I've been trying to live in two worlds, and I've put you both in the crossfire. That ends now." He stood up and began to pace, not with agitation, but with the focused energy of a general planning a campaign. "They want a story," he said, more to himself than to me. "Fine, we'll give them one, but it will be our story, told on our terms." The next morning, Julian Sterling did something he had never done in his entire career. He called a press conference, not to announce a merger or a new product, but to talk about his personal life. He didn't hold it at his corporate headquarters, but in the small, unassuming community center in Pilsen, where he had first seen Leo. It was a brilliant strategic move, shifting the narrative from a place of power to a place of community. He walked to the podium alone. I watched on a monitor from a back room, my heart pounding. He looked directly into the sea of cameras, his face calm, his voice steady. He didn't read from a script. He spoke from a place so deep and honest, it silenced the entire room. "For the past 10 years, he began, I have lived with the belief that I could not have children. It was a private pain that has shaped much of my life and my work." He went on to explain, without naming Victoria, that he had been the victim of a devastating medical fraud, a lie he had only recently uncovered. And then he looked straight into the camera, his grey eyes holding the gaze of the entire world. 4 years ago, a series of events brought a woman named Amelia Hayes into my life, however briefly. Due to the lie I was living under, I had no reason to believe that our encounter had resulted in a child. I was wrong. I have a son. His name is Leo. He is 4 years old, and he is the best thing that has ever happened to me. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Amelia Hayes is not my mistress. She is a remarkable woman who has raised our son with incredible strength, grace, and love, completely on her own. She has asked for nothing, and deserves everything. The failure here is not hers. It is mine. For 4 years, I was an absent father, a stranger. That is a debt I can spend the rest of my life trying to repay." He then laid down the law. Any news outlet that harassed or photographed his son would face the full, formidable weight of his legal team. Leo was a child, not a public figure. His privacy was not negotiable. He ended with a statement that shocked me to my core. "I have spent my life building an empire of things, but I have come to realize that my only true legacy is my son, and my only future is with my family. Amelia, Leo, and I will be taking some time to build that future in private. Thank you." With that, he walked off the stage, leaving behind a room of stunned, silent reporters. In 5 minutes, he had completely rewritten the narrative. We were no longer a scandal. We were a story of redemption, of a long-lost family finding its way back together. He had used his power not to hide, but to protect us with the truth. That night, he didn't go back to his mansion. He came back to my apartment. He brought takeout from Leo's favorite pizza place. We ate on the floor like we always did, but something had fundamentally changed. The space between us, the cautious distance we had always maintained, had vanished. The press conference had been more than a strategic move. It had been a public declaration. He had claimed us not as a responsibility, but as his family. After Leo was asleep, we sat on my lumpy sofa, the sounds of the city a distant hum. "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why tell the whole world about the lie, about everything?" He turned to face me, his expression serious. "Because the truth is the only thing that's real, Amelia. I've lived in a world of lies, some told to me, some I told myself. I'm done with it. Leo deserves to grow up knowing his story isn't a dirty secret. It's just his story, and so is ours." In the soft glow of the lamp, his eyes searched mine. For the first time, I saw not just a father, not just a billionaire, but a man. A man who was as lost and as hopeful as I was. A man who was trying to build a bridge across the chasm that separated our lives. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering on my cheek. It was the same gesture from that night in the car, but this time it wasn't born of desperation. It was tender, deliberate. "That night," he began, his voice low, "I was at my lowest point. I was a ghost, and then you appeared. Another ghost. I never told you what happened before I got in the car." He told me then about the engagement party, about Victoria's cruel words, about the deep, soul-crushing wound of his supposed infertility. He laid his broken pieces out for me to see, just as I had laid mine out for him. In that moment, we weren't a CEO and a waitress. We were just Julian and Amelia, two people whose lives had collided in a moment of shared pain and had, against all odds, created something beautiful. The space between us became charged, the air thick with 4 years of unspoken words, of what-ifs and might-have-beens. He leaned in slowly, his eyes asking a question his lips had not yet formed. And this time, when he kissed me, it wasn't the desperate whiskey-fueled collision of a stranger in the dark. It was a question. It was a hope. It was a quiet, tentative, and infinitely precious beginning. It was the closing of one chapter and the terrifying, wonderful first sentence of the next. Our story hadn't started with love, but with loneliness and desperation. But maybe, just maybe, that's where it was finally headed. It was a future that was unwritten, messy, and real. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to turn the page.